In December 1944, the Ardennes Forest was known to the American GIs as the Ghost Front. It was a quiet sector, a place where battered divisions were sent to rest and green divisions were sent to learn the ropes. The terrain was rugged. Deep ravines, dense pine forests, and narrow, winding roads that snaked through steep valleys. Military history and conventional wisdom stated that this terrain was impassable for a large mechanized army in winter. In 1940, the Germans had shocked the world by driving their panzers through the Ardennes to conquer France. But that was in May. The ground was dry. The days were long. Now, it was winter. The ground was freezing. The days were short. Allied intelligence believed that the Germans were beaten. They believed the Wehrmacht was incapable of launching a major offensive. They certainly didn't believe the Germans would try to push heavy tanks through a snow-covered mountain range. So, the Americans manned the line lightly. They huddled in their log cabins and foxholes, trying to stay warm, waiting for Christmas. They didn't know that on the other side of the Our River, the Germans had assembled a massive force. 3 armies. 200,000 men. Nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns. The German commanders, Model and von Rundstedt, were skeptical of the plan. They looked at the narrow roads on the maps. They argued that the heavy Tiger II tanks, 70-ton monsters, would destroy the road surfaces. They argued that if one tank broke down, the whole column would be stuck. But Hitler overruled them. He was gambling on the terrain. He believed that the element of surprise, combined with the impassable nature of the forest, would allow his troops to slip through the American lines before the soft Americans could react. He was counting on the Americans being road-bound. He believed that once the Germans captured the key crossroads, like Bastogne and St. Vith, the American logistical system would collapse. He didn't realize that the American system wasn't built on maps, it was built on bulldozers. The German offensive was timed to coincide with a specific meteorological event, Hitler's weather. A massive low-pressure front moved over northern Europe. It brought thick, low-lying fog and heavy snow. This grounded the Allied Air Force. The Americans relied on their air superiority to smash German columns. Without the planes, the Germans could move in daylight. On December 16, at 5:30 a.m., the artillery barrage began. Then, the Ghost Front came alive. Out of the mist came the white-painted panzers. The American defenders, stunned and outnumbered, were overrun or pushed back. The Germans advanced. They captured the initial villages. They seemed unstoppable. But almost immediately, the terrain began to fight back. The roads of the Ardennes were paved with cobblestones or macadam, designed for farm carts, not 70-ton King Tigers. The heavy German tanks chewed up the roads. The mud churned up by the tracks froze into jagged ruts. Then the snow started falling harder. The German drivers, peering through narrow vision slits, struggled to keep their beasts on the road. If a tank slid off the road into a ditch, it was stuck. And because the roads were often cut into hillsides, there was no way around. The German timetable began to slip. They had planned to reach the Meuse River in 48 hours. But they hadn't accounted for the friction of winter. They hadn't accounted for the fact that a blitzkrieg requires speed, and speed is impossible when the road under your tracks is turning to ice. They had gambled that the Americans would be paralyzed by the shock. They assumed the American reaction would be slow and disorganized. They didn't know that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was about to turn the battlefield into a construction site. By the third day of the offensive, the German attack was suffering from a self-inflicted wound. Gigantism. Hitler loved big tanks. The Tiger II, King Tiger, and the Jagdtiger were terrifying weapons. They were heavily armored and carried massive guns. But they were too big for the Ardennes. They were too wide for the village streets. They were too heavy for the stone bridges. And they were gas guzzlers. As the German spearheads pushed west, they created a massive traffic jam behind them. The narrow roads became clogged with a mix of high-tech armor and low-tech logistics. Horse-drawn artillery wagons were mixed in with the tanks. Supply trucks skidded on the ice. When a lead tank ran out of fuel or broke a track, the entire column stopped. German commanders screamed into their radios. They watched helplessly as their timetable evaporated. They were sitting ducks. Although the Allied Air Force was grounded by fog, the American artillery was not. American forward observers, retreating but still watching, called down fire on the stalled columns. The German traffic jams became killing zones. The Germans had underestimated the logistical difficulty of moving an army through a forest in winter. They had assumed that capturing the American fuel dumps would solve their problems. But the Americans burned the dumps before the Germans could get to them. The impassable terrain was proving to be impassable, but not for the defenders. It was impassable for the attackers who had brought the wrong machines to the fight. They had brought race cars to a mud bog. While the Germans were stuck in traffic, the Americans were getting to work. General Eisenhower threw his reserves into the breach. But moving reinforcements into the Ardennes was a nightmare. The roads were just as icy for the Americans. But the Americans had a secret weapon, the Engineer Battalion. Every American division had an attached battalion of combat engineers. And every battalion had heavy equipment. Graders. Cranes. And most importantly, Caterpillar D7 bulldozers. The Germans cleared snow with shovels. The Americans cleared it with blades. As the 101st Airborne raced to Bastogne, and Patton's Third Army pivoted north, the engineers went ahead of them. They worked in freezing darkness. They worked under mortar fire. Their mission was simple: keep the road open. They scraped the ice off the tarmac. They spread tons of sand and gravel. They pushed wrecked trucks into the ditches to clear lanes. When the Germans blew a crater in a road, the dozers filled it in 10 minutes. When a bridge was blown, they brought up the Bailey bridges, prefabricated steel kits that could span a river in hours. The German commanders were baffled. They would look at a map and say, the Americans cannot move forces from Metz to Bastogne in less than 4 days. The roads are too bad. But the Americans did it in 2 days. Why? Because they brought their own road maintenance crews with them. The American counterattack wasn't just a movement of guns, it was a movement of earth. They defeated that impassable terrain by engineering their way through it. German soldiers, shivering in their foxholes, would hear the roar of engines at night. They thought it was tanks. It was usually a bulldozer, carving a path for the tanks that would kill them in the morning. The Wehrmacht had bet on nature stopping the US Army. They forgot that the US Army was built by a nation that had tamed a continent. The northern shoulder of the bulge was critical. If the Germans captured the road network around Normandy and Elsenborn, they could outflank the American defenses. But the roads were sheets of ice. A 30-ton Sherman tank has steel tracks. On ice, steel tracks offer zero traction. Tanks were sliding sideways into ravines. Trucks were jackknifing. The American countermoves were stalling not because of enemy fire, but because of friction, or the lack of it. Enter the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion. These men were not tank killers, they were road builders. They deployed in the middle of the battle with shovels, pickaxes, and dump trucks. Their weapon was gravel. They opened rock quarries under artillery fire. They blasted stone, crushed it, and loaded it onto trucks. They drove up and down the icy highways, spreading grit and sand by hand. It was back-breaking, freezing work. The engineers worked without gloves to handle the tools better, their hands cracking and bleeding in the cold. But the effect was immediate. The American tanks found purchase. The tracks bit into the gravel. The column started moving again. The Germans, meanwhile, were still sliding. German tank drivers were trying to weld ice cleats onto their tracks, a slow, desperate modification. The Americans just sanded the road. At key choke points, where the ice was too thick, the engineers used flamethrowers to melt it, then quickly swept the water away before it refroze. They worked 24-hour shifts. When the German Kampfgruppe, the spearhead of the SS, tried to advance toward Normandy, they found the American roadblocks manned not just by infantry, but by engineers armed with bazookas and daisy-chain mines. But the real victory was the road surface itself. Because the engineers kept the roads open, the Americans could shift their reserves faster than the Germans could advance. The Normandy Road became a lifeline of grit that strangled the German offensive. The most dramatic moment of the Engineer War happened at the town of Stavelot. Joachim Paper and his SS Panzer Division were racing for the Meuse. They needed to cross the Amblive River. The only way across was a stone bridge in the center of town. Pieper's tanks were approaching fast. The American defense was thin, just a company of engineers and some infantry. The engineers wired the bridge for demolition. But the German tanks were too close. Machine gun fire swept the bridge. The engineers couldn't get to the detonator. A squad of engineers sprinted onto the bridge under fire. They were not fighting with rifles, they were fighting with fuses and primer cord. They had to check the connections. If the charge failed, the German tanks would roll across and nothing could stop them from reaching the fuel dumps beyond. The lead Panther tank rumbled toward the bridge. At the last possible second, the American lieutenant twisted the handle of the hellbox. Boom! The center span of the bridge lifted into the air and crashed into the river. The German tank slammed on its brakes, teetering on the edge of the abyss. Paper was furious. He was trapped on the wrong side of the river. He had to turn his massive column around and find another crossing. This delay was fatal. It gave the Americans time to bring up reinforcements and seal the trap. The blowing of the Stavelot Bridge wasn't just an explosion, it was a strategic checkmate. It forced the Germans onto minor, winding roads that the engineers had already mined or blocked with felled trees, abatis. The German blitzkrieg was reduced to a traffic jam because a handful of engineers knew exactly where to place a few pounds of TNT. While the engineers in the north were blowing bridges, the engineers in the south were performing a miracle of movement. General George Patton had promised Eisenhower he could turn his Third Army 90 degrees and attack the German flank in 48 hours. This involved moving 133,000 vehicles over icy, narrow roads in the middle of a blizzard. It was a logistical nightmare. Usually, moving an army requires weeks of planning. Patton gave his staff 2 days. The burden fell on the engineers. They had to designate routes. They had to signpost them. They had to clear them. The engineers created a one-way loop system. Roads were designated for northbound traffic only. Other roads for southbound. If a truck broke down, the engineers pushed it into the ditch immediately. Nothing was allowed to stop the flow. They painted white stripes on the trees and rocks to guide the drivers in the snow blindness. They built corduroy patches over mud holes using pine logs. They stood at crossroads in freezing sleet, acting as traffic cops, directing the flow of tanks and trucks. The Germans observed the movement but couldn't understand it. "The Americans are moving faster than the weather allows," a German intelligence officer noted. They didn't realize that the Americans were cheating the weather. The engineers were spreading salt, sand, and sheer willpower on the roads. Because of their work, Patton's armor arrived at Bastogne exactly when he promised. The Germans were hit in the flank by an army that, by all rights, should have been stuck in the mud 100 miles away. Patton's pivot was a victory of generalship, but it was executed by the corporal with a map and a flashlight standing at a frozen intersection. The Germans blew the bridges as they retreated, trying to slow Patton down. But Patton had the Bailey Bridge. In the freezing cold of the Ardennes, the steel panels of the Bailey Bridge were dangerous. If a soldier touched the bare metal with a wet glove, his hand would freeze to it. The engineers wrapped the carrying handles in burlap. They worked in shifts to prevent frostbite. Building a bridge in the dark, in a blizzard, over a rushing, icy river, is one of the hardest tasks in warfare. You have to be precise. The pins must align perfectly. The engineers built launching noses, lightweight sections at the front of the bridge to help push it across the gap. They used brute force to push the heavy structure. When the bridge was across, they laid the wooden decking. The sound of hammers echoing in the valley was the signal that the American advance was resuming. At one crossing, the River, the engineers built a bridge in 6 hours under mortar fire. The first Sherman tank rolled across just as the sun came up. The German rearguard, confident that the river was an impassable barrier, was overrun by tanks that had seemingly walked on water. The Bailey Bridge was the erector set of victory. It allowed the U.S. Army to maintain its tempo even in a landscape shattered by demolition. The German engineers had destroyed the infrastructure of Belgium. The American engineers brought their own. And they installed it faster than the Germans could reload their guns. While the big plows cleared the highways, a different kind of logistical war was being fought in the frozen foxholes and tank scrapes. Fuel is the lifeblood of an armored division. A Sherman tank burns vast amounts of gasoline. In the deep freeze of the Ardennes, the standard refueling methods failed. Pumps froze solid. The hoses were stiff as iron bars. The fuel trucks, the Red Ball Express tankers, couldn't get off the main roads to reach the tanks hidden deep in the snowy forests. If the fuel couldn't come to the tank couldn't move. The solution was the 5-gallon jerry can. The American Army had millions of them. And the distribution system became human. It was called the Bucket Brigade. Trucks would drop stacks of jerry cans at the edge of the woods. Then, lines of infantrymen, cooks, clerks, anyone who wasn't holding a rifle, would form a human chain. They would pass the heavy, freezing metal cans hand to hand, up slippery hillsides, through knee-deep snow, for hundreds of yards. It was brutal, exhausting manual labor. Men's hands froze to the metal handles. Their backs ached. But they kept the cans moving. At the end of the line, a crewman would climb onto the back of a Sherman, tilt the can, and pour the precious liquid into the tank. It took dozens of cans to fill one tank. This improvised, manpower-intensive system kept the American armor fighting when the German tanks were sputtering and dying. The German logistical system relied on railheads and large tankers, which were easily bombed or blocked. The American system relied on muscle and the ubiquitous 5-gallon can. It was a victory of the grunt over the elements. The most desperate logistical crisis of the battle was inside the besieged town of Bastogne. The 101st Airborne was surrounded. They were running out of ammunition, medical supplies, and food. They had thousands of wounded men trapped in cellars. The foggy weather prevented airdrops. They needed to land planes. But there was no airfield. Only frozen, snow-covered cow pastures. General McAuliffe's engineers went to work. They had no heavy machinery inside the pocket. They used jeeps towing makeshift plows to clear a short runway. But the frozen ground was too rough for a 47 transport plane. The landing gear would collapse. The engineers had a solution: Marston mats, also known as pierced steel planking, PSP. These were heavy, interlocking steel sheets with holes punched in them. They were designed to build runways on sand or mud in the Pacific. The engineers laid them right on top of the snow and ice. They linked them together, creating a steel carpet over the frozen ground. On December 26, the sky cleared slightly. A lone C-47 glider floated down and landed on the steel mat. It was carrying surgeon teams and plasma. Then the powered C-47s arrived. They landed, taxied to the edge of the mat, unloaded tons of ammunition, loaded up the wounded, and took off again, all in under 20 minutes. It was a lifeline made of steel and ice. The German anti-aircraft gunners around the perimeter tried to shoot them down, but the pilots flew aggressively, hugging the ground. The airfield of ice saved Bastogne. It proved that American engineering could create a functioning airport in the middle of a siege, in the dead of winter. By January 1945, the contrast between the two armies was undeniable. The American logistical machine, despite the weather, was pumping supplies to the front. The German machine was empty. Hitler's entire plan had rested on capturing American fuel dumps. He had sent his panzers into battle with only enough gas to reach the Meuse. But the American engineers had done their job too well. As they retreated, they burned millions of gallons of gasoline. Massive pillars of black smoke marked the spots where the German hopes were incinerated. The German columns ran dry. The roads of the Ardennes became a graveyard of German armor. The most powerful tanks in the world, king tigers, panthers, jag panthers, were found abandoned on the roadside. They weren't destroyed by enemy fire. They were in perfect working order. Their fuel gauges were simply on empty. American soldiers advancing past them would look inside and see the crew's personal effects, letters, photos, left behind in the rush to escape on foot. It was a humiliating end for the Panzerwaffe. They had conquered Europe on the concept of mobility. They died in the snow because they couldn't move. The German staff officers had looked at the map and seen roads. The American engineers knew that a road is only a road if you have the fuel to drive on it and the plow to clear it. The Americans had brought both. The Germans had brought neither. In late January, the weather broke. The sun came out. The Allied Air Force returned to the skies, hammering the retreating Germans. But the battle on the ground had already been won by the shovel and the bulldozer. The Ardennes, that impassable forest, had been conquered. Not by a brilliant strategic maneuver, but by the brute force of American engineering. The final shot of the documentary is a wide, sweeping view of a main road leading east into Germany. It is no longer a narrow, icy track. It has been widened by bulldozers. It is covered in sand and gravel. The ditches are clear of wrecks. On this road is an endless column of American power. Tanks on transporters. Trucks loaded with ammunition. Ambulances. Fuel tankers. It is a river of steel flowing toward the Rhine. The German Wehrmacht had bet everything on the weather and the terrain stopping the Americans. They found out that the Americans didn't fight the terrain, they rebuilt it. General Patton later said, "The engineer is the man who wins the war." In the Battle of the Bulge, the engineers proved him right. They built the road to victory through the heart of winter.